Looking for something to read? Well, these are the books that I've written. Hop on down to the description to find the Amazon links for all 4 of them, and keep your eyes open for more in the future. With that said, on to the video. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and recently I did a video addressing a criticism I'd seen of Gamera Rebirth that I don't think had gained too much traction, and looking around I haven't seen that many people bringing it up, but I figured I would address it anyway just to provide some sort of counter-argument to it. And that was the question of whether or not Gamera Rebirth is anti-American. The ultimate conclusion I reached is that no, not in any particularly meaningful way, I don't think it is. You could certainly take certain elements out of it and claim they are anti-American individually, but you'd kind of be cherry-picking if you did that. And when you take the show as a whole, ultimately, it's no more or less in favor of or against America than any piece of Japanese media on average. But in the comments of that video, I saw another question that I think is worth addressing. The question of whether or not I think the MonsterVerse goes too far in the opposite direction of being pro-America, pro-military, pro-war, that kind of thing. And it's an interesting question. I didn't respond right away because I wanted some time to really mull it over and come up with some sort of, well, I didn't want to just respond on the fly. I wanted to actually think it through, and I believe I have at this point, so here's what I've concluded. As far as the MonsterVerse being pro-America, I don't really see anything in there that screams nationalism. If anything, I see a lot of stuff that could point towards globalism if you get right down to it. But it does, in a certain way, represent America insofar as the cast of characters in any particular movie is definitely diverse. America has always been known as a place that is cultural melting pot, if you will, where people from all over come to and just sort of mingle together, or at least that's what the advertisements say. So that is depicted in these films, and you can say that that's a representation of what America should be, or you could say it is a globalist idea, because not every character in the movies is from America. But at the same time, I don't really think that's the focus of these movies at all. Now, the military aspect and the war aspect, that gets a little bit trickier, because there definitely is a military presence in these movies, undeniably so. There's a military presence in the vast majority of kaiju movies when you get right down to it, because what else is going to fight a giant monster? But the question of whether or not it is pro-military, that is not so clear-cut. The word to keep in mind for this particular discussion is nuance, something that is sadly lacking in a lot of discourse these days, but it's something I encourage you all to keep in mind here, because it's not as simple as saying pro or anti. In fact, we're going to see that there are different ways in which certain ideas can manifest, some of which point towards the same direction, yes, but which may not necessarily be exactly what you'll see as we go along. So let's start with the idea of it being pro-military. This is where our first bit of nuance comes in, because on the one hand, I would say it is pro-military, generally speaking, because we have a lot of military figures throughout each movie, and those characters are depicted generally in a sympathetic light. Kong Skull Island has a military leader who is clearly positioned as a villain, not your conventional typical villain, but a villain all the same. But for the most part, the soldiers and other military characters we see throughout these movies are not depicted as evil. They're not depicted as purely heroic either. They are, I think, at best depicted as sympathetic. where, you know, we see them as human characters the same as any other characters we are following. They're also not depicted as the ultimate fighting force either. That's Godzilla 1998 stuff. You look at that movie, you can definitely say that movie is pro-military far more than the MonsterVerse ever was, considering it is very much almost enamored with the military to the point where they take down the monster, a monster who is at least bears the name of a legacy that says the Army can't take it down, or the Navy, or the Air Force, or any of the military branches. But in the MonsterVerse, the military is depicted more as valiant but outmatched. They want to do their jobs of fighting for the causes that they are ordered to fight for, and they put up a fight, yes, but when all is said and done, the monsters are going to beat them. That's just a given. They cannot win. Now, in that sense, it's not necessarily pro-military, because if it were very pro-military, like I said, it would go the Godzilla 1998 route of having the military actually win. Not so much, though. There's also no sense of, like, I wouldn't say any of these movies are advertising for recruitment. There's nothing in any of them that would say, join the military today, go sign up at your local office, we're always looking for new recruits. I mean, that's an extreme, I realize, but that is another way in which something could be seen as pro-military, where it is essentially advertising for the military. But I don't think that's the case in any of these. I think in the most you can say about it is that the movies are sympathetic towards the military. They're not against the military at all, but they're not so enamored with the military that they are going to... You get the idea. I think it's more of a neutral depiction for the most part. So, in that sense, the movies are not strictly pro-military, but they're not strictly anti-military. In fact, you could say almost that the military aspect might just be an aesthetic, because there is a bit more to discuss. You see, branching off from the pro-military aspect is whether or not the movies are pro-war. Because you could argue that being pro-military could generally lead to the idea of being pro-war, because what other purpose does a military serve other than to fight in a war, should a war happen? And each of the different MonsterVerse movies ultimately end with some kind of conflict against an opponent. So, does that mean the movies are pro-war? Well, this is once again where I ask you to remember the word nuance. Because again, there are different levels to this. Different things can be pro-war in different ways, and they can be anti-war in different ways. MASH, for example, is steeped in military culture, but it is an anti-war book/movie/series. Again, not necessarily anti-military, though it is kind of anti-military bureaucracy, if you will, and anti-government meddling and whatnot, but still not necessarily against the idea of the people within the Army. But in terms of what it thinks of war, it has nothing good to say about war. But what about something that's pro-war? Can something be pro-war and nuanced? You'd be surprised. If you'll bear with me for just a moment, I have some examples of how there can be different kinds of pro-war stuff, but they have nothing to do with Godzilla. I still ask you to listen, though, because they are relevant. My first example is a Humphrey Bogart movie that I'm sure all of you have at least heard of, because it's Casablanca, largely considered to be one of the best American films ever made, counted right up there with Citizen Kane. Now, I've spoken at length about that movie in other videos. I think you should check them out. It's some of my best work, actually. But the general idea, just to summarize, is that Casablanca, and I'm pretty sure this had to be deliberate, Casablanca can be seen as an allegorical telling of how America entered the war, not literally showing the events, but creating a scenario that represents it, with each character representing the different nations involved in the Atlantic theater specifically. And Bogey's character, Rick, specifically represents the United States of America, where he starts off wanting nothing to do with it, isolationism, gradually realizes that he's getting dragged into it whether he likes it or not, and ultimately ends by getting directly involved, taking direct action, and his presence is ultimately for the better. I just don't see how you can watch the movie and not see that allegory, unless you know nothing about World War II. But how is that a pro-war message? Well, its form of being pro-war, because it was made during the actual conflict, is basically to say, we didn't really want to get involved in the first place, but we had to get involved. Even though this isn't our fight, we will finish it all the same. So that is how Casablanca can be viewed as, technically speaking, pro-war. But there's another Humphrey Bogart movie which takes a slightly different approach. It's one you might have heard of, but it's not as well known as Casablanca. It's called Across the Pacific. The story about that film is Bogey plays a military officer who was dishonorably discharged, or at least that's the public story. It's actually his cover because he's a spy who is going in to report on, investigate, and by the end thwart an imperial Japanese plot to subvert America's military. And the timeline presented in the movie tells us that these events take place right up until December 6th, right before Pearl Harbor is bombed. So it's kind of a revenge story, if you will. And you can look at it as being pro-war in saying, we should have gotten involved sooner, and if we had, boy, we really would have let you guys have it, because just one of our guys is worth at least 20 of yours. So it's a bit more overt in its pro-war ideals. And also very anti-Japanese if you ever go in to watch it. It's not a bad movie aside from that, but brace yourself. It was the mindset of the time. Or there's a third movie that's not a Humphrey Bogart film called This Land Is Mine, which is a war movie insofar as it takes place in a country that's been taken over by the German forces, a fictionalized region of Europe that's like a fusion of all the places that were occupied at the time. And while there's no actual military conflict that happens in it, there is still a sense of needing to rise up and stand against this tyranny. It even ends essentially with a call to arms to that effect. And how do most people interpret the idea of standing up to tyranny? By fighting a war. So there's this sense of you should fight because it is the morally right thing to do in This Land Is Mine. Are you seeing what I'm getting at here? There are different ways that something can be pro-war. You can also, of course, be pro-war in the sense of you can just say, we need to go in guns blazing wherever we feel like because it's what we're supposed to do for our country, because reasons. But that's just, again, one particular way that you can be pro-war. Does any of that apply to the MonsterVerse, though? Well, let's go through each film. Alright, so is Godzilla 2014 pro-war? Definitely not. It is the closest we ever get to the MonsterVerse being strictly anti-military, though again, it's relatively neutral in that regard. Its primary idea is that mankind just needs to step out of the way and let nature take its course, except that there are some things you just can't control. So every time we see the military try to get involved by using weapons or something, it doesn't help. If anything, it just makes matters worse. And in that regard, Godzilla 2014 certainly is not pro-war. Kong Skull Island is also anti-war, as you would expect from something that draws inspiration from Vietnam. Think about what happens. The Skull Island expedition goes in, starts dropping bombs, which provokes Kong to fight back because he doesn't care if it's scientific or not. All he knows is that they're waking up skull crawlers by doing that. And they see him and instantly shoot back. They basically make an enemy. They address this whole idea throughout the entire film, where mankind basically went in where it didn't belong and antagonized a certain faction, in this case Kong, into becoming the enemy. Now, whether or not that exactly lines up with the Vietnam War, I mean, again, there's a long and nuanced discussion to be had there. But the point is, for this specific idea, for this specific film, that is exactly what happened. However, we can also look at the end and see that Kong Skull Island ends with a fight that does require a certain degree of military intervention. And the same thing happens with King of the Monsters, wherein you have the entire military backing Godzilla as he fights King Ghidorah in Boston. Again, they mostly get destroyed because that's how it works in these movies, but they're still charging in with Godzilla, fighting against this alien invader. Now, how are we to interpret that? Are these movies ultimately being pro-war anyway? Not necessarily. Remember how I said the military aspect could be viewed simply as an aesthetic? Well, let's break this down here. Let's get back to Kong Skull Island for a moment. Anti-war up to a point, but it still ends with a conflict. Why? Because it's a necessary conflict. You can actually look at that in all of the other three quarters of the MonsterVerse. Kong Skull Island, King of the Monsters, Godzilla vs. Kong. Each of them has an aspect where there is a certain conflict that happens up to a certain point in the movie, which a particular character may be in very passionate support of, but it ultimately winds up being a wrong cause. And then we are faced with a new enemy, or perhaps an enemy that was there the whole time, that we should have been facing, and we should have been actually working with our perceived enemy against, but, well, things didn't quite work out that way. In Skull Island, the original idea is that Packard sees Kong as the enemy, but it turns out the actual enemy is the Skull Devil and the Skull Crawlers in general. King of the Monsters, Mark sees Godzilla as his enemy, but the real enemy is King Ghidorah. In Godzilla vs. Kong, Kong sees Godzilla as his enemy, but the real enemy is Mechagodzilla. Now, what's the common thread between all of those things? In each instance, you have a character who has a personal desire to fight a particular conflict, but the actual conflict that should be addressed is something that goes well beyond the self. Packard wants to fight Kong because he doesn't like how things went with Vietnam, the whole withdrawal without being able to actually declare victory. So he makes Kong his enemy just so he can say he had a chance to win. When Mark goes against Godzilla, it's because he wants vengeance for the death of his son, which, yes, is tragic, even if it was accidental, but he is so laser focused on killing Godzilla that he doesn't consider that Godzilla might actually be necessary, which it turns out to be the case when King Ghidorah starts destroying the entire world. In Godzilla vs. Kong, Kong goes up against Godzilla because Kong no longer has a purpose, and he is seeking one, and what greater purpose can one have than to slay God and claim his throne? The result is that it nearly gets him killed, and it leaves Godzilla too weak to take down Mechagodzilla on his own. And Mechagodzilla is going to destroy everything, you may recall. So, the common thread is that you have personal, selfish vendettas contrasted with selfless causes worth fighting. And that's a pretty common storytelling trope if you think about it. The protagonist or some character starts the story wanting something and ends the story by accomplishing not what they want but what they need. Unless, of course, that character is the antagonist or the villain, in which case he sticks only with what he wants and faces the consequences. So that, I think, is where we should land with these movies. The military aspect is there, but like I said, it's an aesthetic. The general idea is that we're looking at tales of saying that there are conflicts that should not be fought. There are causes that are not worth pursuing. But there are causes that should be pursued, causes you should fight for. And sometimes that does mean actually fighting, especially if you're up against something that truly cannot be reasoned with, cannot be fled from, and cannot simply be ignored. That's where I ultimately land. I don't think these movies are nationalistic, warmongering military propaganda. I think they're just telling these tales of fighting for causes through the lens of military and monsters. And that's my ultimate take on the matter. I hope I said it clearly enough. But, I don't know, maybe I missed something? Maybe you have something to add, or maybe a different point to consider? That's what the comment section is for, so go ahead, say your piece. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. Thank you all for watching. If you want to see us keep doing what we're doing, you might consider doing all the usual YouTube things, as well as hopping down to the description to find links to DeviantArt, Patreon, Twitter, and links for the different books in the Tales from the Omni Vault universe. Your support is naturally appreciated. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.